Meta stands for the most effective tactics available. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. No, we're not going to do this bit. Let's look at something that challenges this typical definition of meta. At the start of Splatoon 3, the most common weapon composition at the top level of play was 3 sloshing machines and usually something like an E-liter or Flingza, some defensive weapon that would play in the backline. For a small period of time, we called this the triple machine meta. People made memes about it to compare it to 3 in Splatoon 2. However, a few weeks later, it became painfully obvious that the meta was actually 3 splash-o-matics and 1 machine. This revolved around Crab, something we didn't even use at the very start few weeks of the game, with completely different comps. So, let me ask you guys, since this was clearly a much more effective and available tactic, was 3x machine ever meta in the first place? What meta actually means is the strategies, weapons, comps, whatever, that work in games in your respective skill level, as well as any strats that are used to win against it. Before we get higher up, let's start really basic and talk about the meta in C rank. Yes, there's a meta in C rank. When I played C rank in tower control, it became painfully obvious that what 90% of people were doing was face rushing the tower and standing on top of it the whole game. So the meta revolves around this very simple strategy of rushing tower. The strategy to beat that is basically anything that can take advantage of it. Area of effect weapons that can hit the 3 people standing on tower? Check. Flanking and shooting it from a different angle? That works too. Having something like a charger that can sit far away and just shoot people standing on tower? That probably works too. Basically, the meta is just punishing this strategy. When people get out of C rank, you're gonna fight a bunch of people who already figured this out, and you're gonna have a bunch of people who play like that, and the meta will be what beats that. And this process evolves and goes on, solo, all the way up to team play, until you reach the very top level of the game, which is different. For example, the Splatoon Stamper at top level is seen as one of the best weapons in the game. You can go back and look through top player rankings over the past year and see this weapon at pretty much the top of the tier list every single time. However, it doesn't actually find that much success near the bottom of competitive level, even at a team play. This is because the strategies, team compositions, and player skill that make Stamper meta isn't developed at this level of play. This isn't to say that Stamper is bad at that level, more that it's not meta, it's not in the same spot. Most discussions around meta that you've probably ever seen or heard of revolve around the top of the meta, the highest level of play where we've optimized the game somewhat and have the best players. How do people discover and figure out these meta strats in the first place, and how do they evolve over time? Well, for that, there's 2 different perspectives on creating a meta, the developers and the players. Now, the developers obviously have a lot of control over what ends up being good. I mean, they made the game and they balanced the game. That's a pretty sizable impact. But what exactly do they want to do? I've seen a lot of people talk about the idea of balance changing to just try and make a perfectly balanced game. Eventually, though, people realize that that's basically an impossible task. So what then? What should the developers do when balancing a game? Well, obviously the trend of making stuff more viable, especially across multiple different roles and weapon classes, is usually a trend. But oftentimes there tends to be other goals in mind of how they want people to play the game. We can even use the Splatoon 3 devs as an example. If you go back to the very early patches, you could see notes where they mention weakening playstyles that involve players sitting back and spamming subs and specials. This is a playstyle, not just any playstyle, but one that used to be good. Flingza Roller at the start of the game was one of the best weapons in the game because it was really good at sitting back and spamming specials. Despite it making the weapon less viable, the changes they did to stuff like missiles were to weaken that playstyle. So in this case, the balance changes are a lot about what you want people to do, or the game's direction, a goal that the devs might want, and that's why it's important for updates to have a consistent pattern. The best players of the game are always going to gravitate to whatever makes winning easier, no matter what. There's a common statement that players will optimize the fun out of a game, and Come on, we've seen this. Have you guys seen Splatoon 2? I'm gonna put the Area Cup matchup. This has been background footage for me for like 2 years because it is the perfect example of so many problems with this game. And that's what it is. It's top players finding the best way to win the game, even if that way is sitting back and farming special and painting his own for 5 minutes. This isn't to say Splatoon 2 didn't have a game direction though. The devs wanted a coordination-based game, and once you understand that, you can see it everywhere, from how the stages are laid out, the individual kit power, how they balanced weapons and nerfed a lot of the top tiers, the design of the specials to work better when coordinated with other people. All of it. This doesn't mean the changes they did for Splatoon 2 are good because they had a solid vision, it just explains why things are the way they are. Having a clear vision is rare though, and as players, especially when we don't get as much communication, we can kind of only really speculate off of what it is based on the direction we got. And oftentimes, this direction might get sacrificed to make weapons better. For example, the blob is a weapon that does everything we know the devs don't want it to do. It sits back and paints for a special and spams it the whole game. We know that's not what they want. However, in an effort to make the weapon better, they ended up buffing its paint, sacrificing a goal in game direction for better balancing. There are always going to be these trade-offs when improving or weakening something. If a weapon is buffed too significantly, oftentimes the way it's nerfed will have to be different than the way it was buffed. You can also see this when they tone back other options. For example, Crab was nerfed to make it slower, which is a core part of its identity and something that existed already. It was just strengthened in order to weaken it balance-wise. This is why it's important not just to buff and nerf options, but do it in an important way. It's not just about making something better or worse, it's about what the change is going to do for the people playing the game. And for the record, balance changes aren't just for the pro level. Sometimes you have to balance specials for other options. Splashdown's a good example of that, where it was made faster to help at higher level play, but was given a smaller radius to help with lower level play. Balance changes have to account for everyone, not just the pros. There's also one more way of balancing something that's a lot more interesting but risky, which is adding new features entirely, like having a Reef Slider paint on the rails before you move forward, giving you a way to trap opponents, or giving Inkstorm its new healing ability. This is really great for changing specials like Storm, which don't really have a lot of knobs you can tweak. Like, think about it. What can you actually change about Inkstorm? The duration, damage, and paint. That's basically it if you don't add something brand new to the special. That's where these kind of effects come in. But the big risk with this is it becomes a core part of the special's identity. In Splatoon 2, they gave Stingray shockwaves, and despite it being a terrible decision, it was something they could never go back on. That's a very small look into game balancing, but it's some things I think the devs might consider when making changes. But what about our players, the ones who actually form the meta and change it? Obviously, the best players are always trying to find strategies to increase their chances of winning. For a team-based game like Splatoon, that means a few things tend to matter as consistent trends. The toolkit of each weapon, like what it can do, the sub and special it has, and what it's bad at. Playstyles, stuff like more aggressive pacing, passive, paints, kills, whatever style you're building towards. And finally, the team composition. What combination of weapons can best achieve the playstyle we're trying to go for? These are things players figure out over time by testing different ideas and evolving from there. For a small-scale example, let's take a look at a relatively established comp that got changed a bit in Japan. The main meta comp in that region right now was Squeezer, Slosher, Pencil, and a short-range shooter. Comp utilizes Squeezer and Slosher's insane killing power with a Pencil for stability, giving them tools like Cooler, pain output, or combo damage to enable them while being a consistent spot they could jump to. The short-range shooter changed around a lot recently, but found the most success right now with Neosplash. A lot of people push back on this idea because on paper, Neosplash doesn't seem like that strong a short-range shooter. It's much weaker at fighting than the other options, and is much more limited to painting and spamming strike. But that's the thing. If you look at it just as Neosplash without the other 4 weapons, it isn't that great an option. But when it's being paired with this comp specifically, it covers a big problem. Slosher and Squeezer have horrible paint. You need something to make up for that. Squeezer also gets a ridiculously low amount of specials, so having a weapon that gets a lot of them to help you get in and also paint cover the main flaws of the comp, while the other weapons cover Splash's naturally poor fighting capabilities. This isn't to say that Neo Splash is overpowered, it's just that when it's picked with the right comps, it ends up being a really solid option. What is weak or strong often depends on other factors already in the meta. Remember when people said Pencil was bad? That's because it was. At the time when you had stuff like Splashes hanging back and spamming Crab, you didn't want an anchor that wasn't going to do any damage to Crab, got a special that the weapons in the meta didn't want to utilize, and couldn't walk forward with its teammates Crab. Obviously Pencil, Cooler, and even Sprinkler were all weaker at the time, but the bigger factor was the meta they were a part of. There's another factor to this though. Obviously not every good player is trying to find the most optimal comp and will play whatever is meta. Some people just like to use the weapon they want to use. This is common in any game, where someone might see potential in an underused option and try to develop and showcase what it can do to change opinion on it. Most of the time, this doesn't work out, but sometimes it does, and that brings new and unique options to the table, which depending on how good it is, might influence what else is ran. For example, there's a roller player in Japan named Adori who pushed the weapon quite a lot, and ended up showcasing that it changed how people would play the game quite effectively, since the weapon was extremely reliable at killing up close, which forced the opponents to play more scared and be more cautious to contest space. This meant the opponents had to play differently. There was different counterplay to Roller, for example running stuff like Point Sensor to locate it, and this is what you want for a meta development from a player standpoint. Multiple variations of different strategies and options that force players to adapt to keep it interesting. However, sometimes the opposite can happen. In Crab meta, there were a lot of different ideas tried against it, but nothing could end up beating it consistently. The most we saw were slight variations that always kept the core double splash the same, and this is usually where balance changes were needed. So on the player side, it's a constant development to find strategies that consistently work and test weapons to either bring new ideas to challenge it or enhance the idea further to make it stronger. Obviously, there's a lot more to meta development than this, but I tried to get the main ideas here as to how these kind of things form. At the end of the day, what becomes good is something neither the players or the developers can really predict, and the constant history of any competitive game to try to get something ideal and what even is the ideal is a never-ending debate. But anyway, that's all the time I got for today. This video was a bit different, so let me know any questions or thoughts you have in the comments below, and I'll see you all next time.